The wind didn't howl in the Blacktooth Mountains. It screamed with the voice of something that had been freezing for 1,000 years. Lyra lived in a weather observatory at the peak of the Devil's Spine, a jagged tooth of rock that sliced through the clouds. At 22, she was the youngest observer the Meteorological Council had ever sent, primarily because no one else was desperate enough for the isolation pay. Her job was simple: monitor the barometric pressure and keep the solar arrays clear of ice. But 3 weeks into the winter solstice, the sky broke. The snowfall wasn't white, it was a bruised, sickly gray, falling so thick and heavy that the world beyond the reinforced plexiglass vanished within minutes. The silence that followed was absolute, a heavy, suffocating blanket that seemed to muffle the very sound of her own heartbeat. She was checking the perimeter thermal cameras when she saw the first anomaly. On the edge of the northern precipice, a heat signature appeared. It was human-shaped, but glowing with an impossible intensity, a bright, white-hot flare on the blue-black screen. It wasn't moving, it was just standing there, facing the observatory. Lyra checked the exterior sensors. The temperature outside was -60 degrees, instant death for any living creature without a pressurized thermal suit. She blinked, and the signature shifted. It didn't walk, it simply reappeared 10 feet closer to the airlock. Panic, cold and sharp as a needle, pricked at the base of her skull. She radioed the base camp, but the only response was a low, rhythmic grinding sound, like teeth chewing on frozen gravel. The power flickered. In the brief moment of darkness, Lyra felt the pressure in the room drop. The air grew so cold her breath didn't just mist, it crystallized and fell to the floor like tiny shards of glass. She grabbed her heavy tactical flashlight and swept the beam across the living quarters. The walls were beginning to frost over, but the frost was growing in patterns that looked like lace, or perhaps like human veins. Tink, tink, tink. The sound was coming from the observation dome. Something was tapping on the glass, not with a fist, but with a single sharp point. Lyra climbed the spiral staircase, her boots clanking hollowly on the metal. When she reached the top, she saw it. On the other side of the 3-inch thick reinforced glass, a face was pressed flat. It was a woman, her skin a translucent frozen blue, her eyes nothing but hollow pits filled with swirling snow. She had no eyelids, and her lips had been stitched shut with jagged silver wire. The woman wasn't breathing, yet she was tapping a long, icicle-like fingernail against the pane, perfectly mimicking the rhythm of Lyra's frantic heart. Then the woman's mouth began to move behind the stitches, the wire pulled taut, tearing through the frozen flesh, and a sound vibrated through the glass, a high-pitched harmonic hum that made Lyra's ears bleed. The hum wasn't just a sound, it was a command. Lyra watched in paralyzed horror as her own hand, seemingly possessing a will of its own, reached for the emergency depressurization lever. She fought it, grabbing her right wrist with her left hand, screaming as her muscles contorted. The woman outside smiled, the silver wire snapping one by one, spraying black frozen blood against the glass. "Let us in, Lyra," the woman whispered, the voice echoing not from the air, but from inside Lyra's own marrow. "The cold is so lonely. We just want to be warm again." The heater unit groaned and died. The temperature in the room plummeted. Lyra's skin began to turn a pale, waxy gray. She looked at the thermal monitor on the wall, and her own body was no longer showing up as red or yellow. She was turning blue. She was becoming a part of the storm. The glass didn't shatter, it simply turned into liquid, the frozen woman stepping through the threshold as if the physical world no longer had rules. As the entity reached out to touch her, Lyra realized the terrifying truth. There was no woman in the snow. The storm was a collective consciousness of everyone who had ever died in these mountains, a freezing hive mind seeking a new vessel. Lyra felt her memories begin to freeze, her childhood, her name, the feeling of sun on her face, all being replaced by the eternal screaming white of the mountain. her body stiffened into a statue of ice and bone. The next morning, the sky cleared and the sun hit the devil's spine. A rescue helicopter, sent after the radio went silent, landed on the helipad. The technicians entered the observatory and found it perfectly clean, perfectly warm, and completely empty. There was no sign of Lyra. But as one of the technicians looked out at the fresh, untouched snow on the ridge, he noticed something strange. A line of blue, frozen eyes were staring back at him from just beneath the surface of the ice, thousands of them, stretching for miles across the mountain. And in the center of the path, a single fresh heat signature bloomed on his handheld scanner, a bright, white-hot flare that vanished the moment he tried to track it. Then, from the vents of the observatory, a high-pitched harmonic hum began to play, and the technician found his hand reaching unbidden for the lock on his thermal helmet. The mountain was still hungry, and the winter had only just begun.
The sky over the Kuskokwim Range didn't turn gray. It turned the color of a fresh bruise, a deep, sickly purple that promised a strong of historical proportions. Wren was 24, a distance runner who had sought the ultimate isolation of a caretaker position at the Blackwood Sanatorium, a sprawling Victorian ruin converted into a private winter estate for a billionaire who never showed up. It sat on a jagged tooth of granite, surrounded by miles of hemlock trees that looked like skeletal sentinels frozen in mid-reach. The nearest paved road was 40 miles of ice and gravel away. When the first flakes fell, they weren't the soft, pillowy crystals of postcards. They were sharp, crystalline shards that hissed as they hit the stone walls, sounding like a million tiny insects sharpening their legs. Wren spent the first few hours of the blizzard securing the shutters, but by nightfall, the wind had reached a velocity that made the massive oak beams of the house groan like dying giants. She sat in the great hall, the fireplace casting long, twitching shadows that seemed to dance independently of the flames. That was when she heard the first sound, a heavy, rhythmic thudding against the front door. Not a knock, a collision. Thump. Thump, thump. She approached the door, her breath hitching in her throat. When she looked through the iron-grated peephole, she saw nothing but the swirling white void of the storm. But the thumping continued, lower down, near the base of the door. She grabbed a heavy brass fire poker and cracked the door just an inch. A gust of sub-zero air screamed into the hall, and with it, a gift from the storm. A pile of frozen birds, black-capped chickadees, tumbled into the foyer. There were dozens of them, their tiny bodies stiff and crystalline, but they weren't dead from the cold. As Wren knelt to look, she realized their beaks had been meticulously removed, and in their place, small, jagged pieces of human fingernails had been inserted into the raw meat of their faces. She slammed the door, her stomach heaving. The silence that followed was worse than the wind. It was a thick, expectant silence that felt like it was pressing against her eardrums. The house began to change as the temperature plummeted. The frost on the windows didn't form patterns, it formed words, names, hundreds of names etched in the ice from the outside, most of them dated from the late 1800s. Wren realized with a jolt of ice-cold terror that the names belonged to the patients who had died back when this place was a sanatorium. Then the scratching started. It wasn't at the door anymore. It was coming from inside the walls. Scritch, scritch, scritch. It moved with a sickening fluidity, traveling from the baseboards to the ceiling in seconds. She retreated to the kitchen, the only room with a secondary heat source, but the pipes had begun to vibrate. Instead of water, a dark, viscous fluid that smelled of old copper and formaldehyde began to weep from the faucets. The liquid didn't pool, it moved with a purpose, creeping across the floor toward her boots like a sprawling, black nervous system. Wren scrambled onto the kitchen island, her flashlight beam shaking. In the corner of the room, the shadows began to detach themselves from the floor. They rose up, three-dimensional and dense, forming the shape of a man with limbs that were far too long and a neck that sat at an impossible broken angle. The entity didn't have eyes. Where the eyes should have been, there were only two large, frozen moth cocoons embedded in the flesh. Its mouth opened, stretching wider than any human jaw could, and out came the sound of the wind. Not a mimicry, but the actual physical roar of the blizzard vibrating out of its throat. "The winter doesn't end, Wren," the thing hissed, the voice sounding like ice cracking on a lake. "It just moves indoors." Wren realized then that the storm outside wasn't weather, it was a physical manifestation of the house's hunger. Every snowflake was a microscopic fragment of the souls that had been trapped here, and they were all trying to get back in. She ran for the stairs, but the wood felt soft, like rotting fruit. Her feet sank into the steps, the house literally trying to digest her movement. She reached the second-floor infirmary, the air so cold now that her eyelashes were freezing together. In the center of the room stood an old iron bed frame. On it sat a figure wrapped in tattered wool blankets. It was a girl, no older than 10, her skin the color of a winter sky. She was holding a pair of rusted surgical shears. "The doctor said the cold is the only way to stop the rot. But the rot is in the bones, Wren. You have to take the bones out." The girl stood up, and as she did, her body began to unravel. She wasn't made of flesh. She was a hollow shell filled with the same frozen birds Wren had seen at the door. Thousands of them poured out of the girl's dress, a black flapping tide of feathers and fingernail beaks that filled the room. Wren screamed, backing into the hallway, but the man with the broken neck was there, waiting. He reached out with hands that felt like frozen meat and gripped her shoulders. His touch didn't just burn with cold, it erased. Where he touched her, her skin turned to white ash and blew away in the draft. She fought her way to the attic, the highest point of the house, hoping to find a way onto the roof, but the attic was filled with mirrors, thousands of them, salvaged from every room in the estate, all angled toward the center of the floor. In the reflection, Wren didn't see herself. She saw the girl she would become, a frozen, blue-skinned husk with silver wire for veins. The mirrors began to shatter, one by one, the shards suspended in the air by a localized gravity. They swirled around her like a localized blizzard of glass. "You were chosen because you were alone. The lonely ones make the best foundations. They have no one to pull them back from the white." The voice of the house rumbled, the very floorboards vibrating with the words. The glass shards began to bury themselves in her skin, stitching themselves into her flesh like scales. Wren looked down at her hands and saw that her blood wasn't red anymore. It was clear, like meltwater. She wasn't dying. She was being preserved. She was being turned into a living gargoyle, a permanent fixture of the Blackwood estate. The storm outside suddenly stopped. The wind died to a whisper. The clouds parted to reveal a moon so bright and cold it looked like a hole kicked in the floor of heaven. Wren stood at the attic window, unable to move, her body now a statue of glass, bone, and ice. She looked out over the Kuskokwim Range and saw them, thousands of lights flickering in the woods. Each light was a person frozen in an eternal, silent agony marking the perimeter of the estate. The front door of the mansion creaked open. A new figure walked out of the tree line, a young man, shivering, his car visible in a snowbank a mile away. He looked up at the house, seeing the beautiful, shimmering glass statue in the attic window. He thought it was art. He thought he had found sanctuary. Wren tried to scream, to tell him to run, to tell him that the winter was a trap, but all that came out of her mouth was a single perfect snowflake that floated down through the stagnant air. As the man stepped over the threshold, the names on the windows began to shift, the frost rearranging itself to spell a new name.
his name. And at the bottom of the list, in a script that looked suspiciously like Wren's own handwriting, a new date appeared. Today. The house began to breathe again, a low, rhythmic thrumming of a heart that didn't beat, but froze.
Midnight Hollow. Subscribe for more horror stories. Watch and press the bell icon.